Dawn broke slowly over the Mississippi cotton fields, the kind of dawn that arrived not with brilliance but with a slow gray seeping across the horizon, as though the light itself was reluctant to illuminate what lay beneath it. Mist drifted low between the rows of cotton, and the air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. On the edge of the property where the fields ended and a dirt path began, stood a modest wooden farmhouse with a wide porch, and there, draped over the porch railing, hung a quilt. To the overseer who walked past it that morning, it was nothing. A woman's work, a household object catching the early air. He glanced at it the way a man glances at a fence post or a wagon wheel, registering its presence, finding nothing of consequence, moving on. He had more important things to watch. He was watching the workers in the fields. He was watching the road south where a patrol had ridden through the night before. He was watching for any sign of trouble, any sign of movement, any sign of what he feared most, the organizing intelligence of the people he believed he owned. He was not watching the quilt, and that was precisely the point. Across the cotton field, barely visible through the morning mist, a young man named Elias stopped mid-stride. He was 19 years old, lean and careful, with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from years of learning to make yourself invisible. He looked at the porch for exactly 3 seconds. His jaw tightened. Then he looked away and kept walking, his pace identical to what it had been before, his face identically blank. But inside that stillness, something had shifted. He had read the quilt. He had received his instructions. This is the story of a language that could not be spoken, could not be written, could not be confiscated or burned. It was a language stitched in cotton and shadow, encoded in the geometry of everyday domestic objects, hidden so perfectly in the texture of ordinary life that the machinery of oppression passed it every single day without understanding a single word it said. It is the story of the quilt codes of the Underground Railroad, and of the extraordinary human intelligence that created them. To understand why such a language had to be created, you must first understand what had been taken away. Across the slave-holding states of America in the early 19th century, literacy was not merely discouraged among enslaved people. It was a crime. Teaching an enslaved person to read or write was punishable by law in most southern states, with penalties ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment. The architects of this system understood something fundamental. Information is power, and the flow of information could be controlled. They had calculated every channel through which knowledge might travel, and they had sealed each one. They had not calculated the quilt. In a cramped slave quarter on a Georgia plantation, late on a Tuesday night when the overseer had long since retired, 4 women sat in a tight circle on a dirt floor. A single tallow candle burned on a wooden crate between them. Their hands moved constantly and with purpose, not decoratively, not recreationally, but with the concentrated efficiency of engineers working on a deadline. They were sewing. The eldest among them was a woman named Ida May. She was perhaps 50 years old, though no one had ever written down the exact year of her birth because no one had considered it worth recording. Her hands were broad and calloused, and they moved across the fabric with an authority that made it clear she had been doing this for a long time. She held up a finished quilt block and turned it, so the candlelight caught its pattern, a shape that looked to any uninformed observer like a common geometric folk design. Interlocking forms, a wrench-like silhouette rendered in dark and light fabric. She turned to the youngest woman in the circle, a girl of perhaps 16 whose name was Clara, and spoke in a voice barely above a breath. She told her that this was the monkey wrench. She explained that when this pattern appeared hanging from a specific fence on the road south of the Morrison farm, it meant one thing and one thing only. It was time to begin preparing, not to run yet, not to move yet, but to gather, to collect what was needed, food, an extra pair of shoes if you had them, the names of the people ahead who could be trusted, to gather your courage, which was the hardest thing to collect and the most essential. When you saw the monkey wrench, Ida May told her, the clock had started. Clara traced the pattern with her fingertip, committing every angle and curve to memory, because there was no other way to store it. No notebook, no map, no written instructions, only memory and the pattern itself, and the chain of women who had passed it forward. Outside the thin walls, footsteps passed on the path. Everyone in the room froze simultaneously, the way animals freeze when a predator moves nearby. Not with panic, but with a precise and practiced stillness. The footsteps passed. The breathing in the room resumed. The sewing resumed. On the wall above them, a larger finished quilt hung in the darkness, its surface covered in a sequence of patterns, each one a word in a language that had taken years to develop, and that was transmitted entirely through touch and memory, and the urgent quiet of nights exactly like this one. A man named Thomas had been walking for 2 days when he reached the Crossroads. He was in his early 30s, powerfully built, with the kind of physical endurance that had been shaped not by choice, but by necessity. He had left before dawn on a Sunday, which was the day the patrols were thinnest, moving along the tree lines rather than the roads, staying in shadow where shadow was available, and in stillness where it was not. He carried nothing visible. He wore field clothes. If anyone stopped him, he had a story prepared. A story about an errand, a name to mention, a plausible destination within a few miles. He hoped no one would stop him. He had been given a set of instructions before he left, transmitted in the only safe way instructions could be transmitted, spoken once, quietly, by a woman he trusted, in a moment when no one else was close enough to hear. He had repeated them back to her in a whisper, and she had nodded. Then she had walked away, and he had walked in the opposite direction, and neither of them had looked back. The instructions told him to watch the fences. At the crossroads, 2 dirt roads diverged in front of him. He looked left, then right, then at the fence post to his left, where a small square of cloth, no larger than a pillow, had been nailed. The pattern on it was a crossroads design, 4 quadrants meeting at a central point, each section a distinct shade. He studied it for 4 seconds, reading the arrangement of colors the way a sailor reads a chart. Then he turned right, picked up his pace, and disappeared into the tree line without a backward glance. Half a mile further, a wagon wheel pattern hung from a farmhouse window, a circle of spokes radiating outward, simple and unmistakable. He registered it without slowing. "Load up," it said. "Keep moving. You are on the right road." Another mile, and a bear's paw quilt block appeared nailed to an oak near a stream crossing. 5 rounded lobes in dark fabric, the silhouette of a large animal's footprint. He turned slightly northwest, following the line of the stream, and found what he was looking for. The soft mud beside the water was marked with the prints of a large bear, its path worn deep from seasons of repeated passage, leading away into the forest toward higher ground. He followed the bear. The bear, without knowing it, was showing him the way to water, to safety, to the next leg of the journey north. The wagon wheel, which told travelers the route was active and the path ahead was clear, had been developed through years of refinement by the women who managed the Quilt Code network. The Crossroads, with its arrangement of color and position, indicating specific directional choices, had been tested and adjusted along multiple routes until its meaning was unambiguous to those who had been taught to read it. The bear's paw, drawing on generations of accumulated knowledge about animal behavior and wilderness survival, translated the intelligence of the natural world into a portable visual reminder that could be hung from any fence in any county, without raising a single question in the mind of anyone who had not been taught what it meant. A young woman named Sarah had been traveling alone for 11 days. She was in her mid-20s, and she moved through the undergrowth with a careful deliberateness that was the residue of exhaustion, as though every step required a small conscious decision. Her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth. She had eaten 2 days ago wild berries and a piece of dried corn she had been carrying since Georgia. She was not thinking about food now. She was thinking about the pattern she had been told to look for, and about whether she had already passed it without seeing it, and about what would happen if she had. She had been traveling alone by necessity, not by choice. The group she had started with had been forced to separate at a river crossing 5 days earlier, when the sound of dogs had come suddenly from the south and they had scattered into the forest like startled birds, each person taking a different direction, each carrying in their memory the fragments of the route they had been taught. She had the section from the river to the Ohio. She hoped the others had their sections. She hoped they were still moving. The bear's paw appeared to her at the edge of a clearing, nailed to a massive oak tree at the path's margin, a small dark cloth square showing 5 rounded protrusions extending from a central pad. She stopped. She pressed her hand against the tree trunk and closed her eyes for a moment, not from weakness but from relief, so sudden and intense it required acknowledgement. Then she dropped to one knee and examined the ground near the tree's roots. There it was, a soft, muddy patch beside the root system where a large animal had recently passed, its paw prints clear and unhurried, the path worn by seasons of repeated travel. She followed the direction of the prints northwest and heard water within 20 minutes, a creek running fast over stones, cold and clear. She drank. She crossed at a shallow point she found 200 yards upstream, where flat rocks broke the surface, and she kept moving north, following the bear's trail along the ridgeline, the cold water of the creek still on her lips, the bear's paw pattern still clear in her memory. What the women who designed the bear's paw had understood was something that went beyond the practical. They were encoding into cloth a truth that indigenous peoples of North America had known for centuries, that the land itself is legible, that the movements of animals trace the paths of water and safe passage, that the wilderness is not hostile to those who know how to read it. They were saying, with a piece of dark fabric and 5 rounded shapes, "The bear knows this country better than any overseer. Follow the bear. The land will guide you when people cannot." On the 41st night of their journey, Marcus and his daughter Lily reached a cornfield on the southern edge of Ohio and stopped. Marcus was 40 years old, or close to it. Again, no one had thought to record the exact date of his birth. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a deliberateness of movement that his daughter had inherited. Lily was 14, and she had her father's stillness and her mother's eyes, and she had not complained once in 41 days of walking, which was the thing Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. They were past exhaustion. They were past fear. They were operating on something harder and quieter than either of those things, a flat, sustained will to continue that had no name in English and probably has no name in any language, because it is not an emotion but rather the residue left when all emotions have been stripped away by weeks of cold and hunger and darkness and the sound of dogs in the distance. Marcus raised his arm and pointed upward. He traced an invisible line in the air from the 2 outer stars of the Big Dipper, following their geometry, using them as a pointer the way he had been taught, to a single, steady, unblinking point of light above the northern horizon. He held his daughter's chin gently and tilted her face toward it. She stared at the star for a long moment without speaking. She had seen quilts with this pattern her entire life, a central star surrounded by radiating points, stitched in hundreds of variations onto hundreds of quilts that had hung from porches and fences and barn doors throughout the county where she had grown up. She had always understood that the pattern meant something. Standing in the cornfield that night, she understood for the first time what it meant exactly. He told her that this was the star that did not move. He told her that while all the other stars rotated across the sky as the night progressed, this one remained fixed, standing above true north like a sentinel that never abandoned its post. He told her that as long as they kept that star on their left as they walked, they were moving north. North was Ohio. North was Canada. North was the place the British law had reached before the American law did, the place where the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which had made even the free northern states dangerous, had no jurisdiction. Lily looked at the star, and then she looked at her father, and she said a single word: "Free." He repeated it back to her, and his voice broke slightly on the word, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, standing in the cold Ohio dark with the Milky Way spread above them and the North Star fixed and unwavering at the edge of the horizon, exactly where the quilts had always said it would be. Polaris, the North Star, sits almost directly above Earth's geographic North Pole, and because of this geometric accident of celestial mechanics, it appears stationary to any observer on the ground, while the rest of the night sky rotates around it over the course of each night. Sailors had used it for centuries. Now enslaved people moving through the American South and Midwest toward Canada used it for the same purpose, guided not only by their own knowledge of the sky, but by the stitched reminder of it that had been hanging in plain sight on their porches since childhood. James heard the dogs for the first time at approximately 2 in the morning. He was moving with a group of 5, 2 men, 2 women, 1 child of perhaps 7 named Joseph, who had not made a sound in 3 days, and who Joseph's mother carried on her back when he grew too tired to walk. They had been on the road for 16 days and had made good time, reading the patterns correctly, following the routes they had been given, moving at night and resting by day in the locations they had been told to find. Until tonight, the journey had proceeded with the kind of terrible smoothness that only looks smooth in retrospect. The dog sound came from the south, and it was not the casual sound of a farm dog responding to a fox. It was the purposeful, deep-throated baying of trained tracking hounds working a scent trail, and everyone in the group recognized it immediately and simultaneously, the way people recognize a sound they have feared their entire lives. James raised his fist. The group stopped. He was scanning the fence line to his left, and he found it in the fog. A quilt block hanging from a post, barely visible in the gray pre-dawn mist. The pattern was the Drunkard's path, a series of curved, staggering lines that crossed the fabric in an erratic zigzag, the visual representation of a man walking without a straight line to follow. He understood in an instant. The group could not continue on their current heading, not because of any physical obstacle, but because of a principle that every person in that group already knew from experience. Bloodhounds track scent, and scent follows a path. A straight line of footprints and body odor is a highway for a trained tracking dog. It tells the animal exactly where you have been and exactly where you are going. A zigzagging path, particularly one that crosses water, which breaks the continuity of the scent, creates confusion, forces the dogs to circle and recircle, costs the hunters time, buys the hunted distance. He spoke in a whisper so low it was barely sound at all. He told them to split. 2 groups, different directions, each moving in curves rather than straight lines, each angling toward the creek he knew was half a mile northwest. Water first, then rejoin on the north side of the ridge, at the big elm with the broken crown he had been told to look for. They split in darkness, they moved in curves. They found the creek and crossed it, each group at a different point, each person stepping carefully on rocks, where they could to leave as little scent as possible in the water. They climbed the north ridge in silence. When they found each other again at the broken elm, the sound of the dogs was gone. The woman who had sown the Drunkard's path, whoever she had been, her name lost to the oral tradition that preserved the meaning of the pattern but not always the identity of its creator, had understood something about pursuit that took years of hard experience to learn. She had encoded that knowledge into a visual form so simple and so memorable that a man in a foggy forest at 2 in the morning, exhausted and frightened and with dogs on his trail, could read it in 2 seconds and act on it without hesitation. On a quiet residential street in a small Ohio town, a 2-story white wooden house sat behind a modest fence. It was entirely unremarkable, the kind of house that exists on every street in every small town in the American Midwest, distinguished from its neighbors only by the particular arrangement of its vegetable garden and the slight lean of its porch railing. At night, a single lamp burned in the ground floor window, casting a warm yellow rectangle onto the frost-covered grass. On the porch railing, catching the cold October air, hung a log cabin quilt. The log cabin pattern was one of the most common designs in American domestic quilting and had been since the colonial period. Its design, strips of fabric arranged in concentric squares around a central block, was so familiar, so unremarkable, so deeply embedded in the visual texture of everyday American life that it could hang from 100 porches simultaneously and attract no more attention than a washing line. And this was precisely why it had been chosen as the signal for safe houses. The code was in the center square. A red center meant warmth and welcome, a fire burning, come in through the front. A yellow center meant caution. There had been recent patrol activity in the area, proceed carefully. And a black center, like the one on the quilt hanging from this particular porch on this particular October night, meant something specific and unambiguous to anyone who had been taught to read it. This house is a confirmed station. Come to the back door after dark. Inside the house, a woman named Ruth moved through the rooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. She was a Quaker in her mid-40s, with the particular bearing of a person who has made a decision of conscience so fundamental that it has reorganized their entire life around it. Her husband was away tonight, watching the road south. In the cellar below the kitchen, a hidden room had been prepared. Food, water, clean blankets, a small oil lamp, a chamber pot. It could hold a family of 4 comfortably, 6 uncomfortably, more than 6 in an emergency. Ruth had hosted emergencies before. She heard the knock at the back door just after 9 o'clock. It was the kind of knock she had been taught to listen for. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps. She went to the door and opened it. A young woman stood on the back step with an infant pressed against her chest and an expression on her face that Ruth had learned to recognize. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the immediate predecessor of relief. The moment when a person first dares to believe that the thing they have been hoping for might actually be real. Ruth told her she was safe. She repeated it. You are safe. Do you understand me? You are safe. Because she had learned that it needed to be said more than once for the body to believe it, even when the mind already knew. She brought the woman inside, and the woman told her between breaths that she had been following the quilts for 3 nights. Someone in Kentucky had told her to look for the black center. She had looked for it on every porch she passed for 70 miles. Ruth changed the quilt on the porch before she went to bed that night, replacing the black-centered log cabin with a plain flour sack. The signal had served its purpose. Tomorrow night, if the route was clear, she would hang the black center again. In the winter of 1856, in a large room above a church in Cincinnati, Ohio, 15 women sat around quilting frames arranged in a horseshoe shape. Some of them had been born free. Some had once been enslaved and had found their way to Ohio by routes not entirely unlike the ones they were now helping to maintain. Some had husbands and brothers and children still in the South, whose names they carried like stones in their chests. They ranged in age from 17 to perhaps 65. They were united by a single purpose, which was the management of a communication network that stretched from this room to Tennessee, to Kentucky, to the deep interior of Georgia, transmitted not through wire or paper, but through pattern and memory, and the bodies of women who moved quietly through a landscape that was trying to destroy them. A woman named Harriet stood at the head of the room with a piece of chalk and a rough diagram drawn on a flat piece of wood. She was younger than several of the women seated before her, but her authority was unquestioned, because her knowledge of the routes was the most complete and her judgment about risk had been proven correct too many times to doubt. She spoke with the precise, economical language of a person who knows that every word carries weight. She told them that the garrison farm could no longer be used. It had been visited the previous month by a federal marshal and 2 county deputies, acting under the authority of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which had made it a federal crime to assist escaped enslaved people anywhere in the United States, including in free northern states. The marshal had found nothing. The cellar had been empty, and the family had performed normalcy with sufficient conviction. But the farm was compromised. The wagon wheel on the garrison fence was to be replaced immediately with a plain cloth. Plain meant danger. Plain meant pass by. The new safe stop, she continued, was the widow Morrison's property on the eastern edge of the county. The widow had agreed to hang a black center log cabin from her east-facing window. Travelers approaching from the south should come from the creek side, not the road, because the road had been recently added to a patrol route and was checked twice weekly. She told them that at least 12 people were expected through the network this month, possibly more if the weather moderated. She asked if anyone had new information from the south. 2 women spoke. The information was absorbed, evaluated, incorporated into the network's collective knowledge. The chalk diagram was updated, then it was erased, because a chalk diagram, even on wood, is evidence, and evidence in 1856 could mean prison. What was happening in that room above the Cincinnati church was, by any serious measure, a feat of organizational intelligence that rivaled the operations of any military or government intelligence network of the era. It ran on no budget, it had no official hierarchy, it left almost no paper trail. It operated under constant threat of federal prosecution and, in the South, of far worse. It was maintained entirely by the memory and courage and quiet determination of women whose names history has mostly not preserved, whose contributions history has mostly not recorded, and whose achievement history is only now beginning to understand fully. The river was the last thing. A group of 6, 2 men, 2 women, a child, and an infant who had slept through the entire 23-day journey with a serenity that her parents would later describe as miraculous, stood in the tree line on the American bank of a wide, partially frozen river and looked at the far shore, the Canadian shore. A gray sky pressed down on gray water. The temperature was below freezing. Ice had formed at the margins of the river, and a pale mist rose from the surface, where the current ran fast in the center. A man named Solomon was waiting for them. He was a free black man who had been making this crossing for 11 years, and he had never lost a passenger. And he attributed this fact not to luck, but to the quilts, to the system, to the women back along the route who kept the patterns accurate and the safe houses active and the information current enough to be trusted. He had a flat-bottomed wooden boat, barely large enough for 6 adults and 2 children, and he loaded them in with the efficient care of a man who has done something dangerous enough times that the danger has become familiar without becoming any less real. The crossing took 12 minutes. When the last person stepped onto the Canadian bank, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Solomon did not break it. He had learned to let the silence happen. Then the mother, whose name was Grace, though Solomon did not know this yet, because they had not yet had time for introductions, sat down heavily on a flat rock at the water's edge and began to weep. Not from grief, from the sudden, total, devastating weight of relief, which can feel indistinguishable from grief when it arrives after something long enough and hard enough. The infant remained asleep. The father stood at the water's edge and looked back across the river at the American shore, where the tree line was dark and still and gave no indication of what lay behind it or what they had traveled through to reach this bank. He told Solomon in a low voice that they had followed the Quilts from Georgia. 3 weeks, North Star to Bear's Paw to the Black Center log cabin, all the way up through Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio to this river. Solomon looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Go back and thank the women who sewed them. Every step you took north, they took it with you. Between 1820 and 1860, an estimated 40,000 to 100,000 enslaved people made the journey north through the Underground Railroad. Not a literal railroad, no trains, no tracks, no stations in any conventional sense, but a network of people and places and signals that extended from the deep South to the free northern states, and after 1850, all the way to Canada. The Quilt Code was one layer of that network, but it was perhaps the most durable layer because it was the most invisible. Paper burns, memory fades, but a quilt hanging from a porch railing in the morning sun says nothing to the wrong eyes and everything to the right ones. The debate among historians continues, as it should. Academic scholars who study the Underground Railroad have examined the evidence for the Quilt Code with the careful, skeptical rigor that serious history demands. They have noted that the primary documentation for the code comes largely from oral tradition, from the stories passed down through African American families across generations, rather than from the kind of contemporary written records that historians most trust. They have pointed out that the specific systematic use of quilts as a coordinated signaling network is difficult to verify through archival sources. They have asked legitimate and important questions about the degree to which the code was formalized versus improvised, widespread versus local, uniform versus variable across different regions and time periods. These are legitimate questions, and they deserve honest engagement. But there is another question that the historical debate sometimes obscures, a question that is perhaps more important than the archival one. It is this: what does it mean that this story has been preserved, generation after generation, in the oral tradition of African American families? What does it mean that the memory of the code, whether or not every detail can be independently verified through documents written by people who had strong reasons not to document what they knew, has been carried forward with such tenacity, such specificity, such love? In the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, quilt blocks are displayed in glass cases beneath careful interpretive panels. Visitors move slowly through the exhibit, School groups, elderly couples, families of mixed ages and backgrounds, pausing at each case, reading the descriptions of patterns whose names they may be encountering for the first time. Monkey wrench, wagon wheel, bear's paw, North Star, drunkard's path, log cabin, names that sound in isolation like nothing more than the charming folk vocabulary of domestic needlework, and that carry, in context, the entire weight of a people's determination to survive. In one corner of the gallery, an elderly woman sits with a quilt spread across her lap, demonstrating hand stitching to a group of children gathered on the floor around her. She is showing them the North Star pattern, stitching it slowly, deliberately pausing to let them see each element taking shape. A girl of perhaps 8 reaches out and touches the finished portion of the quilt, her small hand resting gently on the central star and its radiating points. The woman smiles. She keeps sewing. This is what the transmission of knowledge looks like when it has survived everything that history has attempted to do to it. An old woman's hands moving across fabric, a child's hand reaching out to touch it, the pattern passing from one generation to the next through the oldest medium human beings have ever used. Not text, not archive, touch, memory, story, the quilt code of the Underground Railroad, whatever its precise historical parameters turn out to be, represents something that transcends any single verifiable fact. It represents the intersection of domestic art and revolutionary engineering. It represents the collective intelligence of women who had been systematically denied every formal tool of resistance and who responded by inventing informal ones of devastating effectiveness. It represents the truth that human beings, stripped of every legal protection and every institutional resource, will find a way to speak to one another, to warn one another, to guide one another towards safety. Look at the patterns. Look at them the way Elias looked at the quilt from across the cotton field on a Mississippi morning, not as decoration but as a message, not as craft but as code, not as the passive product of domestic labor but as the active instrument of a revolution conducted in thread and shadow, in geometry and courage, in the patient, dangerous, magnificent insistence that the people who had been told they were property were, in fact, and in fact always had been, human beings with the full human right to freedom. The monkey wrench said begin. The North Star said go north. The log cabin said you are safe here. The bear's paw said the land will guide you. The drunkard's path said do not go straight, do not be predictable, do not make it easy for the people hunting you. And the quilts, collectively, said what all great acts of resistance ultimately say. We are still here. We have not stopped. We will not stop. Follow the thread.
See the stitches? They hold the story together.
How long does it take?
Patience makes it beautiful.